She didn't even blink before saying it. Economy is boarding in the back. The words were delivered with practiced professionalism, but behind the poise lay something else. Assumption wrapped in authority. The kind of microjudgment that didn't need to be shouted to cut deep. Her eyes didn't scan the boarding pass in his hand. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. She simply looked him over, decided he didn't belong, and offered correction instead of welcome. Matt Ellison stood still, boarding pass in hand. No protest, no visible reaction. Just a pause, the brief, still moment where a man chooses between asserting himself and observing how far the error will go. Have you ever been judged before you even spoke because of how you looked, not who you were? In a world that still tolerates quiet bias, it's time we choose to speak louder. If you believe discrimination has no place in 2025, share this story. Hit that subscribe button to support us. The passengers nearby stiffened. Some turned away, uncomfortable with what they heard but unwilling to intervene. Others stared with a faint smirk or confusion, waiting to see if he would argue. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, the story rewound just a few minutes, back to where it had all begun. The boarding area for Flight 227 to San Francisco hummed with familiar rhythms. Rolling luggage, coffee machines, the tinny crackle of gate announcements. Nothing about the gate suggested it would become a national headline. Just another weekday flight. Just another group of business travelers and holidaymakers. Matt had stood quietly near the first-class lane, hands relaxed around a weathered leather backpack. His look was clean and simple. Dark jeans, a slate hoodie, and neat sneakers. The kind of outfit that was intentional in its understatement. He didn't dress to impress strangers. He dressed to move unnoticed. But that invisibility didn't hold up when he stepped forward. As he approached the gate, his digital boarding pass already scanned, the flight attendant at the door, tall, poised, efficient, had taken one look and frozen. It was not surprise but pause. The kind that signals someone recalibrating their expectation of the world they believe they control. She hadn't greeted him. Not like the others. Her posture stiffened. Her face didn't falter, but her hands did, subtly shifting the tablet in her grasp as though it needed more scrutiny to explain what her intuition refused to accept. He handed her the boarding pass. She looked at it, but didn't scan. Instead, she glanced him up and down, slowly, deliberately, and when she spoke, it wasn't to say his name or direct him to his seat. It was to redirect him entirely. Economy is boarding in the back. The rebuke was soft but surgical, just loud enough for those within earshot to hear, just pointed enough to remind him and everyone else watching that his presence had been flagged by something deeper than protocol. Riley Carter, a student flying standby for the first time, had seen it all. She hadn't meant to record anything that morning, but something about the way the man stood there, quiet, composed, and completely unshaken, made her open the TikTok app without thinking. She started recording just before the attendant tried to wave him aside. She didn't know who he was. She didn't need to. What she saw was enough. A black man, calm and prepared, being told he didn't belong by someone who didn't even bother to check if he did. Matt, meanwhile, simply stood. His documents were in perfect order. His seat assignment, 1A, was visible on both his phone and the printed version. He didn't hand them over in protest. He simply offered them like a mirror. The attendant, now visibly flustered, took the pass and studied it. Not for accuracy, but for contradiction. As if she were hoping it would explain away the mistake she'd already made. Behind her, the jet bridge echoed with footsteps. Other first-class passengers filed in without incident. Some looked back at Matt, puzzled. One man in a blazer raised an eyebrow. Another leaned in toward his wife, whispering under his breath. Still, Matt said nothing, because this wasn't about the seat. It was about the moment, and how many people would choose to witness it fully. The attendant handed the pass back, still without scanning. She said she would need to verify it with her supervisor. Her tone was even, but her eyes avoided his. She didn't ask anyone else for proof. No one else had been delayed, but she had made her choice and she clung to it. Riley's livestream viewers began to multiply. Dozens became hundreds in minutes. The comment feed came alive with disbelief. He's not even raising his voice. She didn't check the ticket? We've seen this too many times. This is what bias looks like. The plane wasn't scheduled to depart for another 45 minutes. But for Matt, the countdown had already begun. Because time wasn't measured by the clock anymore. It was measured by how long it would take for truth to catch up with perception. And it was moving fast. 15 minutes had passed since Matt Ellison was stopped at the gate of an airplane he had every right to board. 15 minutes since his identity had been silently, then publicly questioned not by procedure but by presumption. And now the air around him felt heavier. The tension had changed from awkward to unmistakable. From a simple moment of gatekeeping to something far more consequential. He stood as still as he had when it began. No raised voice, no gestures, no confrontation, only a stillness that refused to be moved. Behind him, Riley's livestream view count ticked upward again. The video feed now moved faster than she could keep up with. Comments exploded like sparks. He's still not on? Why is nobody doing anything? This is insane. Someone call corporate. You can feel the quiet rage in this man's posture. The crew had stopped making eye contact with him. The supervisor, now talking softly on the radio behind the check-in desk, kept glancing over his shoulder toward Matt, then toward the boarding door, then back to the tablet. The screen still read 1 a.m. Ellison. Verified. Checked in. Cleared. But the discrepancy wasn't in the technology. It was in the mind of the person interpreting it. The plane was due to leave in just over 30 minutes. But the aircraft remained half-board, suspended in a holding pattern caused by a single human judgment. And now, that judgment was being broadcast to tens of thousands of viewers, in real time with no PR filter to protect it. The supervisor's voice had changed. His body language, once confident, had grown hesitant. He leaned into his earpiece, nodding, murmuring, checking the manifest again. There was nothing new to discover. The documents were in order. But still, Matt stood unmoved. At 16 minutes past the start of the incident, Matt slowly reached into the inner pocket of his hoodie. The movement was calm, deliberate, without hesitation. He didn't look around for approval. He didn't explain what he was doing. He took out a slim black phone, sleek, silent, business-issued. No notifications, no distractions. Just a direct line to the one thing most people in that terminal didn't know he possessed. Leverage. He scrolled briefly, found the name, tapped once. The call didn't ring more than once. No words were exchanged where others could hear. He stepped slightly to the side, speaking in a low tone, calm and efficient. It wasn't anger in his voice. It was clarity. It was the sound of someone who wasn't asking for help. He was initiating action. He didn't mention the gate, the supervisor, the boarding pass, or the seating dispute. He didn't need to. The person on the other end already knew the context. They only needed a single phrase to begin what was coming next. The entire call lasted less than 20 seconds. No more than a few lines. A brief silence. Then confirmation. When he ended the call, he placed the phone back in his pocket and returned to the exact position he had held for over a quarter of an hour. Still, silent, composed. But something had shifted. Not visibly, not in him, but around him, as if the atmosphere had noticed that stillness had turned into command. The gears had begun to turn in places invisible to the people around him. Offices far above the airport concourse, conference rooms with glass walls and leather chairs, inboxes blinking with high-priority flags, Slack threads flooding with urgency. Somewhere, a crisis response team was already receiving word that there had been a problem. Not a policy violation, a mistake. A mistake involving someone whose influence didn't show up on a flight manifest but lived in capital flows, legal contracts, and quarterly shareholder reports. 20 minutes into the delay, the first email landed on the inbox of Sky Atlantic's VP of Operations. It came not from a passenger complaint hotline, but from the inbox of an executive assistant who reported directly to the chairman of Elcor Capital, the firm that controlled 18% of Sky Atlantic's voting shares. The subject line was simple, urgent. Flagged incident involving Matt Ellison on Flight 227. By the time the VP opened it, a second email had already arrived from internal legal. Then a Slack ping. Then a news alert. Because while Matt made his call, Riley's video had crossed 78,000 views. And trending hashtags had begun to climb the Twitter/X algorithm. Hashtag boarding bias. Hashtag CEO justice. Hashtag Flight 227. The content moderators at the airline's social media team began tagging one another in alarm. Is this real? Wait, who is this guy? Someone check the investor database. Matt Ellison? That Matt Ellison? The panic was beginning. Quietly. Behind screens. Behind glass walls. In offices that were not prepared for what this story could become if it wasn't handled within the next 10 minutes. Back at the gate, no one had yet told Matt to move. But no one had cleared him either. He remained suspended in purgatory, not because of any fault of his own, but because systems built on perception often freeze when confronted with reality they didn't expect. The supervisor had stopped pretending. He was no longer checking systems. He was no longer updating the crew. He was waiting for a call. Any call. From someone above him to explain what he had gotten wrong. Inside the aircraft, whispers had turned into open murmurs. Some passengers checked their phones and gasped when they saw the live stream. Others texted family members. You won't believe what's happening on this flight. And yet Matt remained unmoved. Not because he was waiting to be allowed in, but because he had already stepped into something much larger than the space between the gate and the seat. He had triggered a reckoning, and now he stood at the center of it, still, composed, immovable. It had taken 45 years of experience, 20 years of building Elcor capital, and 15 minutes of undeserved scrutiny to set this moment into motion. But in the next 25 minutes, an entire airline would be forced to decide whether it wanted to protect its image or transform its identity. And Matt would never have to raise his voice to make that decision for them. By the 22nd minute, the silence that had once surrounded Matt Ellison was now mirrored by a very different kind of silence. This one born not of bias, but of dread. Inside Sky Atlantic's corporate headquarters in Chicago, the 14th floor executive suite was beginning to buzz. Not with conversation, but with red flags. Notifications blinked on monitors. Assistants typed faster than usual. And for the first time in a long time, mid-level executives paused between emails to really look at the subject lines coming in. The first alert had come from legal. Not an external complaint, but an internal escalation, flagged and marked critical. A potential conflict involving a top-tier stakeholder. The name hadn't caused panic yet. Not until it was opened. Not until the word Matt Ellison appeared. Followed by a short line explaining the gate incident, the delay, and the apparent mishandling of a verified first-class ticket by flight crew. No threats. No lawsuit mentioned. Just a cold report from the assistant to the VP of Equity Partnerships. The room grew heavier as realization began to crystallize. There weren't many names that could rattle a publicly traded aviation company. But this one did. Matt Ellison was not just a wealthy businessman. He was a precision operator. A man whose firm, Elcor Capital, held structural equity across multiple transportation, logistics, and aerospace entities, including strategic influence over Sky Atlantic's engineering contracts, route expansion funding, and future fleet modernization. He wasn't loud. He didn't attend press-heavy panels. But his name, to those in the right circles, carried weight. And the idea that he was currently being detained, delayed, doubted, dismissed by the company his portfolio helped stabilize, that sent shivers up the chain of command. The second ping came from social response. It was worse than they'd anticipated. A viral TikTok, streamed live, now circling X, formerly Twitter, Reddit, and even Facebook. Riley Carter, an aspiring travel influencer with just under 40K followers that morning, was now closing in on 150K by the minute. Her video, a quiet, shaky stream showing a calm black man being denied entry to first class despite showing a valid ticket, had passed 90,000 live viewers. And rising. Hashtags were trending. Not just one. Not just generic outrage. But phrases that felt pointed and precise. Hashtag boarding bias. Hashtag Sky Atlantic shame. Hashtag let him sit. Hashtag Ellison incident. Media monitors lit up with early headlines. Another airline. Another bias? Black CEO questioned at gate. Flight delayed. The calls started next. Legal called PR. PR called operations. Operations looped in HR. And all of them hesitated, waiting for someone higher up to decide who would be the first to call Matt. But Matt wasn't waiting for a call. He never had to. He had already spoken, with clarity and brevity, to the only person who mattered, the chair of Sky Atlantic's Board of Governance, who also sat on the Elcor Partnership Oversight Committee. A woman who understood that when Matt Ellison made a phone call, it wasn't a threat. It was a signal. Not a grenade, but a scalpel, quiet, swift, and surgical. Down at the airport, the gate crew remained unaware of the full scope of the storm they had triggered. The supervisor's earpiece buzzed again, but this time, he didn't look calm. His eyes darted to Matt, then to the flight door, then back to his handheld device. He didn't know exactly what had changed, but he could feel it, like watching a thunderhead gather at sea while the sun was still shining. Inside the aircraft, the whispers had turned into a murmur that carried. Someone had recognized the name from their LinkedIn feed. Another had seen it mentioned on CNBC. The businessman in 3A turned to his wife and mouthed, "He's important, I think." A flight attendant quietly backed away from the cabin door, nervously refreshing her inbox. When she checked the manifest again, a new banner had appeared next to seat 1A. Not just confirmed. It now read, "Do not disturb. VVIP." The designation was rarely used. Reserved for only a handful of figures, board members, foreign dignitaries, major investors. The kind of title that made people snap to attention, even if they didn't understand why. Matt hadn't moved. He remained where he was, his presence undiminished by the delay. If anything, it had grown stronger. There was a kind of dignity in his stillness now that made it impossible to look away. He wasn't performing strength. He was simply being it. Back at HQ, an emergency call was underway. Senior leadership sat around the long oak boardroom table, half-dressed in weekend sweaters and hastily buttoned shirts, their faces lit by the glow of laptops and iPads. No one said it out loud, but they all knew what had to happen. They couldn't undo what was already going viral. They couldn't erase the fact that they had failed to train their frontline staff on how to handle not just black passengers, but black excellence that didn't look the way they expected. The real risk wasn't financial. It was reputational. Because if Matt Ellison spoke publicly, if he issued a statement or worse, pulled his stake, the market would respond. By the 27th minute, the company's VP of brand strategy drafted a response memo. Not a statement, a framework. One that laid out immediate steps. Acknowledgement, apology, action. But before it could be released, the damage was already unfolding in real time. Sky Atlantic stock began to dip. Not drastically, but noticeably. Enough to signal volatility. Enough to raise eyebrows on financial news tickers. The press had picked up the scent, and by minute 29, a breaking news segment was queued up for morning broadcast. Anchors rehearsed the lead. Another moment of bias in the air. But this time, it was the wrong man to underestimate. And still, through all of this, Matt said nothing. Because he didn't need to. He had already spoken where it counted, with influence, not volume. With stillness, not outrage. He knew better than anyone that real power doesn't scream. It waits. And while it waits, it quietly prepares to change everything. By the 30-minute mark, the illusion of control had dissolved. Inside Sky Atlantic's aircraft cabin, passengers sat uneasily in their leather seats. The quiet tension now fully visible in every glance, every silenced conversation. No one had dared approach Matt Ellison since the gate delay began, but everyone had an opinion, spoken or not, about what they were witnessing. Some cringed, others watched with growing unease, while a few simply stared out the window, hoping not to be implicated by silence. Up front, the crew wore the kind of stiffness that comes from sensing the ground shifting beneath their feet. The lead flight attendant, Chelsea Morgan, once so confident in her interpretation of protocol, now stood by the galley wall like someone awaiting sentencing. Her uniform still crisp, her posture still upright, but the certainty had drained from her face. In its place, a slow dawning realization that what she thought had been a routine judgment call had become something else entirely. Something irreversible. No one had told her outright, but she knew. She had felt it when the gate supervisor returned and avoided her eyes. She had felt it when the manifest updated mid-flight prep with a glowing red label, escalation, internal priority. And she had especially felt it when passengers, once docile, began pulling out their phones. Not to scroll, but to document. Matt remained at the entrance, still waiting. Not because he had to. He had been cleared to board 20 minutes earlier. But he hadn't moved. He was waiting for the moment to conclude properly. Quietly, on his terms. Back in Chicago, the boardroom had reached consensus. A formal message had been drafted, preliminary acknowledgement of the incident, pending investigation. But what truly mattered was what came next. Containment. Or change. The CEO of Sky Atlantic, a woman known for her iron poise and minimal public exposure, had already joined the crisis call. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. Her voice, calm and edged with disappointment, carried more force than panic ever could. She had built a reputation for leading from behind closed doors. But this was different. This time, the issue wasn't just operational. It was cultural. And Matt Ellison was not just another disgruntled customer. He was a man whose silence spoke louder than their PR team ever could. He hadn't issued a statement. He hadn't tweeted. But his mere stillness had already shifted the airline's internal culture more in 30 minutes than any diversity training had in 5 years. By the 34th minute, Chelsea received a message on her crew tablet. It was brief, impersonal, procedural. Crew Lead 1A. Please report to flight management upon landing. Flagged for internal review. Immediate debrief required. Her hand trembled slightly as she tapped the screen away. Not because she didn't expect it, but because the inevitability had finally arrived. No apology she might draft would undo the fact that her face, her name badge, her tone, and her decisions were now frozen on thousands of smartphone screens, archived by the internet. She hadn't used any slurs. She hadn't yelled. But that was precisely the issue. The damage hadn't come from overt hate. It had come from assumption dressed as professionalism. Down in the terminal, word had reached the media. Cameras began assembling quietly near the Sky Atlantic press podium. Press liaisons were briefed. No comments beyond the script. No deviation. No questions. Only acknowledgement that an incident had occurred and was being reviewed. But the media wasn't waiting for an official statement. The story had already been shaped by the people. The narrative had written itself in real time, stitched together by live streams, screenshots, and subtle expressions that no PR team could rewrite. 35 minutes in, the airline's internal Slack threads exploded. Someone had leaked a screenshot of the updated manifest note. Another shared a clip of Riley Carter's video, which had now reached over 1.3 million views. Then came the name drop, Matt Ellison, Elcor Capital. The realization spread like wildfire. Someone muttered in the exec suite. She questioned the man who signs the engine maintenance checks? And just like that, accountability stopped being theoretical. The COO authorized an immediate crew review. Chelsea Morgan was to be removed from the active roster pending investigation. It wasn't a firing yet, but it was close. The legal team advised restraint, but also noted that swift response was essential. Delay, in cases like this, wasn't seen as caution. It was seen as complicity. On board, Chelsea finally approached the forward cabin. Not to speak, but because the cabin manager had signaled for her. The other attendants avoided eye contact. Not out of cruelty, but discomfort. She had led them confidently into a moment that was now engulfing all of them. The manager handed her a printed message from Central Dispatch. It was short, cold, official. Crew Lead Morgan. Immediate removal from outbound flight schedule. Debrief scheduled at ORD. Media containment in progress. PR to follow. She didn't cry. She didn't protest. She simply folded the message and tucked it into her jacket. Because it wasn't just her shift that was ending, it was the way she had seen her role. The quiet gatekeeper. The silent filter of belonging. The person who had believed that neat uniforms and years of routine were enough to shield her from introspection. 37 minutes after Matt had been stopped, the corporate chain had begun its public response. Not in a press release, but in action. Chelsea Morgan would be grounded indefinitely. The COO would appear on camera for the first time in 2 years. And Matt Ellison? He still hadn't raised his voice. Because for men like him, whose presence alone threatens weak systems, the loudest thing they can do is stand still. 45 minutes had passed since Matt Ellison was told he didn't belong in the first-class cabin. The plane had not yet left the gate, but something else had taken flight. In those 45 minutes, a single moment of assumption had unraveled the careful polish of a billion-dollar airline. Not through violence nor protest, but through the quiet, unrelenting weight of one man's presence, amplified by millions of eyes who chose to watch and remember. By now, every major news outlet had either clipped the live stream or published a breaking story. The incident, once confined to a gate at O'Hare International, had become a national conversation. Not about rage, not even about race in the surface-level sense so many companies feared, but about how dignity could be systemically denied with a smile, and how silence could echo louder than shouting when wielded by someone whose power needed no introduction. Sky Atlantic's executive leadership had long prided itself on modern values. But values without structure are performance. And the performance had just collapsed mid-stage under the pressure of reality. The CEO, whose voice had rarely been heard outside investor meetings, authorized a full operational stand-down for the flight crew involved. The COO had instructed the DEI team to halt all scheduled workshops and instead submit an emergency overhaul plan within 48 hours. And the legal department began preparing for what they now understood as inevitable scrutiny from the federal government, shareholders, and perhaps most critically, the public. But amid the procedural chaos, it wasn't fear that moved the company. It was exposure. They hadn't been caught doing something illegal. They'd been caught doing what was normal. And that made it worse. In the terminal, the tension around the gate had transformed. Where there had once been discomfort and disbelief, there was now clarity. No one needed an announcement to understand what was happening. Matt had finally boarded, but not to sit. Not yet. Instead, he had requested to speak with the airline's senior-most operations officer, on the ground. The request was relayed through a regional manager, then corporate, then dispatched to the crisis response director. It was the kind of request no one refused. The meeting took place in a quiet, windowless room just off the tarmac, one typically used for HR debriefs or mechanical logs. But that day it became a chamber for change. Matt entered without a team. No advisors, no entourage, just a phone in his hand, a folder under one arm, and the same calm that had defined him since minute one. The operations officer, sweating through a suit that wasn't designed for scrutiny, stood when Matt entered. But Matt didn't extend a hand. He didn't smile. He didn't sit right away. He placed the folder on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were 3 sheets of paper. The first detailed a pattern of boarding-related discrimination complaints filed over the past 18 months, nearly half of which had been resolved with silent settlements. The second showed internal diversity metrics for frontline staff, 89% white, 92% of managerial flight crew promotions going to the same. And the third, quietly devastating, was a copy of the airline's DEI mission statement, printed alongside a time-stamped image of Matt being blocked from boarding. No speeches were made. No confrontation occurred. Only facts, quiet and inarguable. And when Matt finally did speak, it wasn't to condemn. It was to outline. He didn't want compensation. He didn't want public flattery. What he wanted was structure. A system that would prevent what happened to him from happening to someone who couldn't make a phone call to collapse the room around them. He proposed a framework, 3 pillars of change. First, mandatory bias recognition and equity training for every employee, not once but quarterly. Not optional. Not digital checklists. In person. Assessed. Tracked. Second, the creation of a real-time passenger reporting tool embedded into the airline's mobile app, allowing passengers to flag discriminatory incidents in-flight, mid-boarding, or during service. All reports to be reviewed by a third-party audit group, not internal PR. Third, the formation of a standing passenger equity council, composed of frontline employees, executives, and independent observers. Their charter? To publicly report on all complaints, trends, and corrective actions on a quarterly basis. He didn't request the council. He stated it as necessary. And in that room, no one argued. Minutes later, the COO signed the Emergency Compliance Directive. It was the fastest internal policy shift in the airline's history. Faster than any previous union negotiation. Faster than any technical recall. Because now it wasn't about logistics. It was about survival. And beneath that, authentic accountability. Meanwhile, on social media, Riley's original livestream crossed the 2.5 million mark. Her quiet narration, unpolished, uncertain, human, had struck a chord. Not because she offered commentary, but because she had simply borne witness. She had pointed her phone and let the truth speak. In the following days, she would be contacted by journalists, networks, even publishers. But in that moment, seated by a gate she hadn't expected to matter, she just watched Matt reemerge from the meeting room with the same posture he had walked in with. Upright, silent, resolute. He didn't need to say a word. The change was already in motion. Chelsea Morgan was officially suspended, but not terminated. Matt had intervened, not to spare her, but to ensure that her consequences would serve a higher purpose. She would be the first to complete the revised bias rehabilitation program, designed by external consultants, funded in part by Ellison's own philanthropic division. If she passed, she could reapply for a position not as flight lead but as a trainer. The message was clear. Redemption is earned, not erased. Back at HQ, the airline's internal chat lit up with stunned reactions. Employees, many of whom had stayed quiet for fear of retaliation, began sharing their own stories. Stories of being passed over, of being warned not to overreact, of watching passengers like Matt be questioned for their dignity. Now they spoke, and someone was listening. By the 45th minute, Matt finally took his seat in 1A, the same seat he had been assigned all along. He buckled his belt, closed his eyes, exhaled once. The aircraft door closed behind him. But the door to something far bigger had just opened. 6 months had passed since a quiet moment in Gate B-23 became a national reckoning. What began with one black man denied his first-class seat had rippled far beyond a single flight, a single airline, or even a single industry. The incident was no longer just a trending video or a viral hashtag. It had become a case study, a cultural milestone, and a mirror held up to institutions long accustomed to their own unchecked reflections. Sky Atlantic had changed. Not cosmetically, not in a press release, checkbox, PR spin kind of way, but structurally. The reforms proposed in that quiet room off the tarmac had not only been implemented, they had been expanded. Every flight crew member now completed quarterly bias recognition labs, facilitated by third-party facilitators with real-life lived experience, not just corporate consultants. The once optional diversity modules were now embedded into the airline certification cycle, treated with the same weight as emergency response drills. More remarkably, the passenger equity app, once an idea Matt outlined on a notepad during that meeting, had launched and gone live within 90 days. The tool allowed passengers to discreetly report perceived bias or discriminatory treatment in real time. Each report was reviewed by an independent oversight panel, and a quarterly summary was publicly posted on Sky Atlantic's website. The results were hard to ignore. Discrimination-related passenger complaints dropped by 63% in the first 3 months. Incidents flagged for escalation decreased by nearly 70%. But perhaps the most telling metric wasn't a number at all. It was in the testimonies. In the thousands of quiet, often anonymous notes submitted to the Passenger Equity Council from people who finally felt seen, finally felt heard, finally believed they had recourse. What had once been a whispered experience among travelers of color was now logged, tracked, and acted upon. Silence had been broken not by shouting but by design. Within the airline's own walls, culture had begun to shift. Frontline employees who had once felt powerless now had a mechanism to speak up. Crew members started having difficult conversations with each other, not because they were forced to, but because the environment demanded it. Managers were trained not only in policy but in listening. And slowly, the unspoken hierarchy of who belonged where began to unravel. But Sky Atlantic wasn't alone. The pressure mounted industry-wide. 3 competing carriers launched internal reviews of their own training programs after shareholders, many of them informed by Matt's public stance, demanded alignment with the new benchmark. Airlines that had previously championed surface-level inclusivity now found themselves forced to examine their pipelines, their leadership structures, their recruiting practices. The FAA had taken note as well. The agency established an independent bias and equity committee to study how unconscious discrimination affected boarding, seating, upgrades, and in-flight service. Matt had been invited to serve on it, but declined. Not out of disinterest, but because he believed the real work was already being done on the ground. He had said what he needed to say without speaking publicly. His impact was already moving through systems and policies, through whispered stories of, "Did you hear what Sky Atlantic did?" spoken with both caution and hope. As for Matt himself, he had returned to his quiet routines. No interviews, no brand building, no victory laps. He flew often, just as he always had, and on each flight he sat in first class without fanfare. Not because he had won something, but because the moment had stripped away the conditions that once made his presence there feel exceptional. It now simply felt normal, and that, in the end, was the point. Riley Carter, the passenger who filmed the original livestream, had become something unexpected, a catalyst. Her video had been viewed over 12 million times. She was now working full-time as a social impact consultant for a nonprofit focused on travel equity. She spoke at universities, on podcasts, and even on a panel hosted by the National Civil Rights Museum. But she often said, privately, that the most powerful thing she ever did was hold her phone steady and not look away. Chelsea Morgan, the flight attendant whose decisions had triggered the incident, had gone through the airline's newly established intensive rehabilitation program. It wasn't easy. The training was rigorous, emotional, and, at times, humiliating. But she didn't walk away. She leaned in. At the end of her program, she reapplied, not for her old position, but for a new one, internal culture coach. She now trained new hires on the power of presence, assumption, and how subtle choices can lead to seismic consequences. Her story, once a symbol of everything broken, became part of the airline's journey towards something better, and the industry took notice. Harvard Business School published a full case study on the Ellison incident, breaking down not only the company's missteps, but also how strategic pressure had driven real, lasting change. The case became required reading in both business ethics and operations courses. Meanwhile, Matt's original proposal, the Passenger Equity Index, had quietly expanded into other industries. Hospitality chains, rental car companies, and even tech platforms began adapting the model. A few even reached out to Elcor Capital for partnership. But Matt didn't license it. He open-sourced the framework, because for him this had never been about ownership. It had been about removing the invisible price of dignity from the cost of access. 6 months to the day after Flight 227 was delayed, Sky Atlantic released a short, unpolished video montage across its social media platforms. There were no actors, no scripts, just voices, passengers, crew members, supervisors, and finally Chelsea Morgan, not to excuse what happened, but to explain what she had learned. The final voice was Riley's, reading a letter she'd received from another passenger who had once been questioned at a gate, but chose to speak up because of her video. It ended with a simple phrase: "What changed wasn't the policy, it was the silence." Back at O'Hare, Gate B23 looked the same as always. Crowds, announcements, coffee, deadlines, but something beneath it had shifted. Matt passed through that gate again one morning, unbothered, unhurried. No one stopped him. No one questioned him. The attendant scanned his pass, smiled, and waved him through. He nodded, not because he was acknowledged, but because finally he wasn't.